Welcome to another Cybersecurity Fundamentals webinar. This week's topic is Universal Virtual Physical Two-Factor Authentication. My name is William Santiago. I'm going to start calling myself Uncle Will based on that article you see on the screen. There's a link. It's a very interesting article about becoming Uncle Jim. So I'll be calling myself Uncle Will, and it's a very interesting article. But again, like I said, topic of this week is universal virtual and physical two-factor authentication, and we'll talk about that specifically and do some examples at the end of the presentation. So just to start, universal physical and virtual two-factor authentication, I may specifically mention the two because not too many people understand or know about there's a physical factor and a virtual factor based on this specific security tool. The idea here is that, aren't passwords good enough? Should we just make very difficult passwords? We all know that passwords can be guessed, and that's the reason for those dice on the screen that you see there. It explains that passwords or passphrases have to be random, and that's what cryptography and the basis of Bitcoin and blockchain, DeFi, crypto space is all about. It's about randomness. Randomness generates these very long numbers or very complicated numbers to provide that secrecy or that exchange in cryptography. Passwords is just a very difficult passphrase or password to guess. So the more random there is in it, the better it is. So people normally don't do that. They just memorize a name or something that they can remember, humans can remember. But the idea here is dice are the best way to generate these very complicated numbers or complicated phases. So there's a lot of articles and videos in YouTube explaining this feature of creating, for example, in cryptography you have private and public keys, how to create these private keys or this combination. You use these dice. You throw them on, throw them out and get some numbers and write them down. So it's a manual process, but it's a very secure way to generate these passphrases or passwords. So the idea here is we normally don't do that, so our password's good enough. We humans have bad memory, so that's why we choose very simple words that we can understand. We're starting to use like the previous webinar that I had last week, which was a manager or a tool that helps you not only generate these very complicated passwords, but also not having to memorize them. So it will handle those for you. We got too many accounts out on the internet, and the whole recommendation is not to use the same password or passphrase for every single account, including not using the phrases for the same wallet. Most people have the same MetaMask wallet, and they have one set of recovery phrases, and so it makes these things more complicated. So it's very hard to have, first of all, have multiple accounts, maintaining it and managing them, but even the necessity of having multiple wallets for that matter. So users start to get what they call security fatigue, sets in. You basically lay back and say, okay, we're going to use a very easy password that I can remember across multiple accounts, and that's when you fall into the trap. And we've been, this is ongoing for the last 10, 15 years. People, reuse passwords. They write them under a keyboard, and that's how hacks happen. There's social engineering, et cetera, et cetera. And so we know where we end up. So what two-factor is and what it brings to the table, oops, let me just clear this out real quick. So the two-factor authentication, what it does is it's an extra layer of security used to ensure that people trying to access an account online are who they are or who say that they are. So that's basically what two-factor authentication is. Another layer of security. So you'll have the username and passwords, that's the first factor, and then you have the second factor, which is some kind of additional layer that gets added, and this is what we're going to be explaining about. So how does this process work? The first thing, like I mentioned, is the user will enter a username into the field, and then they're also going to add a password. And this basically Bitwarden, which is the password manager that I normally recommend, is very good at this. You'll have this app running on your phones, on your mobiles, on your desktops, whatever device you use to get into these accounts. The manager will populate these fields for you. Hopefully the password will be unique for every single site, and even the username might be even unique. That's another discussion for security. But then what happens is that there's another information, or what they call other information. This second factor could come from different categories. One of them is something that you know, for example, a PIN number. So it gets in there and puts a username and password, says, okay, give me your PIN number. That usually happens when you either swipe, we call that swipe. I don't know if in the US they've recently eliminated a few years ago. But the idea there is that you put the credit card and you swipe through a machine. The machine enters this let's say your credit card number, and then the system will say, okay, based on this credit card number, there's a PIN associated with it. Can you enter that PIN on it? And then obviously the system will compare, or the back end will compare the PIN to that credit card, that token that gets generated for that credit card. This is done by a third party, by the way, at the merchant. So the merchant doesn't actually see not even the credit card number or the PIN. So that gets entered, it gets confirmed in the back end, and you get access to your. So this is something that you know, right? So that PIN you memorize, and sometimes the bank gives you that, and then you can't even change that PIN. They just hand it. This is the PIN. It's four numbers, 6 numbers, depending. Another thing is what we call something that you have. And this goes a little bit further, because now you have a physical. Just like we had the swipe card, and ask for a PIN number. It's kind of like that, but it's a little bit more secure because you have a chip inside the card. The card then has some kind of encryption process that happens in that chip. So think of that chip as an enclave. It's a secure element inside the credit card. So this is another way to have a second factor authentication. But on top of that, that also then requires, happens when we talk about something that that also happens because then it comes back and says, oh, we expect to have a PIN associated with this chip request that's coming in. And then the user then puts their PIN number in. And then finally, it's something that you are, and this is where biometrics, fingerprints come into play. And that usually happens either on the device or the phone, that in the case of the iPhones and some of the Android phones, you have your fingerprint or even facial recognition that unlocks the phone, and the phone on your behalf will then talk to these systems in the back end. We tend to try to stay away from those, but we'll explain how or why that happens. But basically, with two-factor authentication, a potential compromise. So if something happens that the username or password gets stolen or access to, or whatever it is, to unlock your account, you can only work if you have both factors, not only one factor. So even if your passwords are stolen or your phone is lost, your account is still safe. So this is the idea behind two-factor authentication. So having said that, you have two-factor authentication types, or 2FA types. Here's a picture of different ones that we can depict. You will see that you have up here, these are hardware keys, or chips for two-factor authentication. They usually have a battery. They were done by RSA back in the day. A lot of the banks use them, and they, very expensive. Certain employees had them, especially. And I worked in the banking system, and employees who dealt with the transactions of the banking system had that, including members of the connectivity for exchange of funds between the banks would have this. And in some cases, users or customers of the bank will have something similar to that, which is expensive, but it was still there. And battery lasts maybe 1, 2, 3 years then you have to change it, etc. It's deployed by an administrator of the bank. Then you have what I recommend is these YubiKeys. These are very robust kind of keys that you put into a machine, and we'll show you an example of one that I use here. Then you have voice-based SMS, two-factor method, which we discourage, but it's still there used a lot, which means that basically an SMS text gets sent to your phone. The problem with that, and that the reason we don't recommend it, is that there's two reasons for that. The first reason is that protocol, the SMS protocol where those messages get through, are clear text, meaning that it's anybody who's can intercept traffic on the internet will see these SMS text messages, and they see the whole content. Most of the United States are still relying on SMS texting back and forth, which boggles the mind because it's complete. It's like exchanging information on the street, and anybody can hear all the conversations you're talking about. So there's no security, no privacy, nothing on SMS. So that could be intercepted. The second is that these travel through the telecom companies, and there's what they call SIM swap, which means that there's social engineering involved in which you can call to the help desk of, say, T-Mobile or AT&T, and say I lost my phone and I need to transfer my number to this new phone so I can get my SMS text. I can keep texting with my family or my business or whatever it is. There's few security measures involved in these type of transactions. So what happens is that if a hacker is very good, they'll be able to fool the help desk into proving that they are the person who they are, and obviously they transfer the phone number to this hacker. So obviously the text messages, the tokens get delivered to the hacker, and so that's why we don't recommend doing SMS. But it's there. It's used on most platforms these days in the U.S. Outside the U.S., it's a completely different story. Then you have what we call software tabs. These are in a case of phones. So you have an app on your phone that will actually have a kind of like a push notification of that 2FA saying, hey, somebody's trying to get into your system. Would you approve this transaction? And you just tap on the phone and let you in, which takes me to the next one, which is push notification, the same thing. So software tabs allow you to see the tokens on your phone, and the push tab notification comes in as a request. And we'll see an example of how that works. We also have besides these YubiKeys, you have Android produces these other ones, which are the typical USB type connection, Type C, and NFC connections as well. So you have these type of devices you can very easily carry around with you. So other forms of two-factor authentication, or what they call biometric two-factor authentications, are fingerprints. So like phones, you can just put your finger on and it will recognize your fingerprint to get it in. But again, these are not foolproof. They could be hacked, and they have been hacked in the past. Retina patterns, which are basically scanning your retina and see if the pattern matches with what they have on the database. I've seen this in action. Some of the tier 3 and tier 4 data centers have these systems on the doors, so just to get into certain access areas of the data center where most of the servers are housed, and you're the administrator, you have to go in there. It has a box and it has a camera, and you look into this black space, and the camera looks at your retina and checks to see if you can go in. Expensive systems to set up, and they're also not foolproof. But in an environment where you want to go in and out of a very secure environment, like a tier 4 data center, these are very popular. Finally, you have facial recognition, the same idea there. I mean, you have iPhone does that a lot, but again, those are not hack-proof, so they could be cracked. So there is a risk involved in using these type of biometric. The industry is still not have matured enough to make these at least close to foolproof. So just to explain how this process works, and just to understand it a little bit better, you have your devices over here, Retina, whatever you're using, your YubiKeys, and you as a user get on a web page, and you want to verify, it's trying to verify who you are. So you enter username and password you normally do, either password manager or by memory, and then it asks for the next information, which is basically your YubiKey. Or your Retina, or your number, or whatever you have on your phone, and you put that in as well. Now, all that information gets sent securely over the back end into some kind of database where it matches. It matches in the case of the YubiKey, it will match a public key. So what you have in the YubiKey is a private key in the enclave of that key. And let me show you that key right now so that you can see what I'm talking about. This is the key right here, and this is where you enter into the slot, the USB key, and it has that slot, that circle there that has the light. If you can see here, it has a little light, and you just touch that. What that does, it's not a fingerprint; it's just a circuit that gets interrupted, initiating a signature. So in other words, that private public key gets signed. We're using that private key inside the enclave of that device, of that specific YubiKey. And out goes a signed, let's say a signed transaction. So only the signature gets out. The private key never leaves the enclave. It just travels all the way to the back end where you have a public key that the database, you have inserted that public key, because it's a public key, obviously it can be, that's your business card, let's call it. And it compares that public key with that signature. And it generates that signature also and says, does that signature match the public key that I have? And if it does, it says, okay, that's the valid public key and a YubiKey. And that happens within seconds or milliseconds when you actually touch that YubiKey. That's basically how it works. Now, how do you protect that in the cloud? You got different applications that are leading in this. You have Authy, you have Aegis Authenticator, Google Authenticator, and you got YubiKey and some other ones that are out there that help in this. In terms of services, you have AWS, Citrix, Cloudflare, Dropbox. I'll give an example of Dropbox, Duo, Facebook, Google, IBM, Instagram, Mac OS, Microsoft, Nintendo, RSA. You can go on and on and on, and you can see that there is a lot of participants out there. Almost everybody now is implementing some kind of two-factor authentication. There's this video link that I would like to show you guys, but I'll add that to the video at the end. And let's take a look at how this all works. So what I wanted to show is getting connected to Dropbox. So what I'll do here is I have a website that I've logged in, which it's Dropbox, a very good example, because they've been using two-factor and YubiKey and all kinds of security since 2003, 2004, early days. I mean, they were using this. So it's extremely important to follow these type of companies that provide security or that use security at the very edge of where it needs to be for other participants in the industry. So what we have here now is this is a desktop Authy version of the application for this two-factor authentication. It looks exactly the same as you see on the screen, but I have it running on my desktop. So in other words, if I'm logging in, I could be looking at this app without going to my phone. But if I wanted to go to the phone, I see exactly the same thing, basically. So I'm going to go back. Let me just go back on the application, bring it up to my presentation. But as you can see, you have all of these tokens that I have. I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds of tokens that I've used to store all kinds of. You click on any of them, and you'll get a 4 token, and it usually times out. So what happens is that the timing out is happening within 30 seconds, and each side it's going through that timing as well. So every time it's generating a brand new number, and those numbers need to match, basically. So let's say I'm logging into Dropbox, so I'm going to go into type Dropbox, and there's my Dropbox. I just search for it, and the number keeps popping up and moving in. Okay, great, no problem. So what happens is that I go into my Dropbox login, whether it's on my phone or on my desktop, and I use my Bitwarden, which is a tool that I explained last week, and I'm going to put and populate the username and password. So password is very complicated. I don't know what it is. It just gets handled by Bitwarden, and he puts the password in there. I'm going to remember myself. Just take that out so it doesn't. And I'm going to click on login. So what happens is I've set up Dropbox for two-factor, right? So what happens is that Dropbox will pop up and say, wait a second, you've designated a hardware key for this, right? But, you know, let's say I don't have my hardware key. I left it home, it's not there, so I cancel. And in the case of Dropbox, I cancel that request. It's looking for that hardware key that I just showed you a few minutes ago. And I've designated other ways to get into Dropbox because I lost my key or I don't have my key with me, right? So use a mobile authenticator instead. And it says, okay, well, give me that 6-digit code. And you can see on the screen that numbers is moving. So I'm gonna pick this one. I got 17 seconds. So I'm gonna do 971-929. That number is gonna change, and that's the two-factor authentication. And it gets me right into Dropbox, right? So I'll show you exactly how to do it on Dropbox. Every application is different, but this gives you an idea of how this all works. So in the case of Dropbox, I'm going to go to my profile up here. I'm going to go to settings, and then I'm going to go to security. And under security, I have different things. You have it, start checkup. Most places, most of these apps will do a checkup to make sure you're secured. You can change obviously you can change your password. Also secure with the Dropbox Password Manager. Everybody's getting into the business of having password managers, trying to compete with Bitwarden and other manufacturers that handle password managers. So actually they're getting into the business of doing it. So you can see there you can download your own password manager and trust Dropbox on how they handle your passwords. Right, so I have two-step verification turned on, and my first preferred method is obviously authentication app. I also have a backup method, which is my phone. It sends some kind of text to the phone. I can eliminate that, and it's just recommended just to take it out. There's also recovery codes. I can show a set of recovery codes. You back them up in case you lose your two-factor and you want to recover them. Recovery of two-factor authentication of these methods is a little bit hard to do. You could. It's not impossible, but the company will do certain due diligence to make sure you are who you are. And obviously the security keys. I wanted to show you the security keys, but here I have added. You can add more, but I have 3 keys. I have an NFC security key, which is the one that I showed you on the screen, which is this one right here. This is an NFC type USB. Let me see if I can, yeah. There it is. That's it. There's also the 5C Nano, which is very small, and it goes. It's a small Type C signature that goes into the Type C setup. And if you put it on your laptop, it's easy to. If you're constantly getting into the system, you can touch it. And then also the 5C NFC, which is a C regular NFC type, the same as the other one, but it's Type C. And obviously these are registered in the system itself, right? So system has them. So now I'm going to go ahead and sign out again, and I'm going to try to log in again, but I'm going to, instead of using my authenticator, I'm going to use my YubiKey as two-factor. So I go ahead and pick my complicated password, which I never remember, and I log in, and it comes back and says, okay, you want to log in, well, do you have a security key that we can use? And it pops up on the screen, and I see my light on the YubiKey turning on because it's lit. I just touch it, and when I touch it, it goes away. It checks, make sure that private key, that signed signature coming out of when I touch it comes out and gets sent to Dropbox. Dropbox compares it to the back end, and so this is basically the top level of how two-factor authentication works. I hope that you enjoy this video, and hopefully we'll see you again next webinar next week and have a different interesting topic. Thank you.